Hi, everyone. I want to talk about Module 3, which is all about growth and fixed mindset. When I learned about this, it was kind of a big aha moment for me in that I really started paying attention to what I say to students and how I say it. And a lot of people in the discussion are doing a great job talking about that. Peter made a great comment in that every day in his class, he tells kids to do their best, their specific best. And I think that's great. I think that's what growth mindset comes down to, is getting students to compete with themselves as opposed to with others. So I often tell my students that their job is to leave leave today's class better off than you came in. That's your job. So that means that you're responsible for taking something away, learning something. Couple of other things before I go to an example. I wanted to add, a few people talked about Joe Buller's book, Mathematical Mindsets. I'll leave the link for that book in this post. And one other thing that I found extremely important is in an article by Peter Liljadal on making thinking classrooms, which I'll also leave the link for below in case you want to look at it. He mentioned that there's only 3 types of questions that students ask. There are proximity questions. They ask questions because the teacher is nearby. There are stop thinking questions, which are questions like, is this right? So it's for them to be able to stop thinking. And then there's questions for them to be able to continue thinking. Like, I don't understand this. How do I do this? And Peter argues that really we should only be answering the third one. The first 2 questions we should acknowledge, have the kids realize that we're there, we're paying attention to them, but that they don't need us to answer the questions that they're asking. And the other thing that I find extremely powerful is when teachers say, I don't know. Those 3 words are so important for students to hear. We think that we're showing weakness, but in fact, we're showing students that sometimes we don't know. And I say I don't know for so many things that I do know, that I feel like a terrible person because I'm lying to my students all the time, but it's extremely important. Okay, so now I want to focus on something that Julia said in her post, and that the types of questions that we ask matter. So we have to ask questions that allow us to foster growth mindset, or else it's not going to happen. Okay, so I'll show you one example. This is a which one doesn't belong question, wodb.ca. Tons and tons of images and numbers and equations that students look at, and their job is to pick which one of these 4 images doesn't belong. The secret in making which one doesn't belong is that all the answers are correct for different reasons. So all I want to see from my students is a bunch of discussion. Okay, so I say to my students which one doesn't belong, and a student might say the top right, and I'll say why the top right, and the students might say because it doesn't touch any axis, right? And I'll say, okay, great. And then somebody else will say, I think it's the top right as well, and I'll say why, and they'll say because it doesn't have any solutions, and I'll say that's great. And then somebody else will say, well, I think the bottom right doesn't belong, and I'll ask why, and they'll say, for example, because it just touches the axis. So it turns on the axis. I'll say, okay, who else? And so we'll go through this, and I'll get a bunch of responses. For example, this one in the top left, someone say X is the Y axis is the axis of symmetry. So that's true. This bottom right, somebody else might say that it only has one solution, which the other ones don't. Here, someone might say that this is the only one that opens up. right? There'll be other reasons for it too. For example, a student might even say that there are two positive x-intercepts, right? Nothing else has that. And students come up with all these things. And all I say to them is I just say thank you. Every time that somebody says something, I say thank you. And then all of a sudden, a kid that doesn't really talk much in math class says, I think that the bottom right one doesn't belong. And I'll say, why? And he'll say, because it doesn't have any arrows. Right? And the other ones do. And some kids might snicker because that seems like a silly thing to say in math class, but that's huge because that actually means something in math. And so we get in a discussion about the fact that these guys go on forever and this guy just stops, and that's important, right? So students that don't often have their voice heard in math class get their voice heard with questions like which one doesn't belong. Um, Dan Mayer is a guy that will be watching his TED talk and kind of talking about the way that he sees things. But he says he often asks teachers to evaluate who feels the love in your class. So in a traditional math class, it's the same two or three kids that feel the love. The kid that can recite the quadratic formula, the kid that can recite the slope formula. Um, those kids are the ones that get love. The kid that said this one has no arrows, in a traditional math class, that kid probably won't feel the love. But my goal in my classes is that I make sure that every kid has the opportunity to feel appreciated and to feel the love in math class. Okay. So I hope you enjoyed which one doesn't belong problems, and we'll talk again module 4.